Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming and welcome to the first session of the Teach Grant Program Subcommittee meetings. We are very excited to have you here to make recommendations. I'm just moving things around because it's not working. To make recommendations regarding department's proposal regarding the Teach Grant Program. Before we go any further, though, as you might expect, I'd like to go around the room and get everybody to introduce themselves and the constituency that we represent. And we'll start to my right with Kira.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kira Taylor. I work at Harvard Law's Legal Services Center. I'm a representative of the legal aid community. Also, I was an elementary school teacher in a Title I school for 3 years in Louisiana and in New York City. So informally, I have also spoken with many elementary school teachers in Title I schools, as well as post-secondary teachers, as well as Teach Grant recipients.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Stephen Payne. I work at the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, or NASFA. Our members are financial aid administrators at over 3,000 institutions across the country, ranging the gamut of all sizes and all sectors. And so our members, of course, are intimately involved. Alyssa is one of our members with us today, and so our members are, of course, intimately involved in the implementation of this program. Happy to be here. Thank you. And I'll just add, sorry, my constituency is organizations or associations that represent financial aid administrators.
Good morning. My name is David Kantafa. I'm Assistant Provost for Educator Preparation for the State University of New York System Administration. So SUNY is the largest comprehensive public institution in the United States. We have 16 colleges or universities that have educator preparation programs that lead to teacher certification, and we prepare 25% of the workforce for New York State and many for other states throughout the nation. SUNY students receive approximately 4,000 Teach Grants annually.
My name is Alyssa Dobson, and I'm the Director of Financial Aid and Scholarships at Slippery Rock University. I'm also the president of PAFSFA, which is kind of like a little NASFA, only it's just for Pennsylvania schools. Not just myself, but the members of the group that I represent as well are heavily involved in awarding, administering, and counseling regarding the Teach Grant. So we work with those students, and I'm here for the 4-year institutions of higher education that award or have awarded Teach Grants.
Good morning. I'm Willis Walter, Dean of the College of Education at Virginia State University. I'm here representing the National Association of Equal Opportunity in Higher Education. With the historically black institutions and colleges, you have about 50% of those that are of color teaching today, and so we see this as a vital part of course, our service to the community and to the country, and so that's why I'm here today. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Debbie Braswell. I'm the Director of Financial Aid at Belhaven University, so these people are my people. Not that you all aren't, but these people are my people. I'm here to represent the CCCU, which is the Christian Colleges and Universities. We are participants, our students are participants in the TEACH program, and we are excited to be seeing some changes coming.
I'm Deborah Kuhlbeck. I'm from the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education, and our members are those that encourage their students to use Teach Grants. And we have over 800 institutions of higher ed and teacher prep programs across the country as our members. And this is a program we definitely support and are looking forward to making it better.
I'm Sophia McCardle. I'm from the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Post-Secondary Education, Policy Planning, and Innovation. And I will be working with you in the 3 sections dealing with the subcommittee for Teach Grants. I actually was the federal negotiator for the teacher preparation issues way back when, where we initially started touching on some of the changes for the Teach Grant program many, many years ago. So this is sort of a continuation of this work. There's several other people in a room that I would like to introduce that will be helping us, all from the department today. We have Aaron Washington, who will be working the screen and putting up red lines as we're moving along. behind me, John Utz from the Office of Federal Student Aid, who's here to provide operational information and support. We have Brian Siegel, who's from our Office of General Counsel. We have Linda Shiwak, who's also from the Policy and Planning Office in OPE, who will be assisting us. And we also have Stephanie McKissick. I want to make sure I get that right, who works with accreditation in our same office. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. I want to just express our appreciation for how much work you're about to do with respect to examining our recommendations and proposals and providing your own. So before, oh, hi. And, oh, okay. Thank you. And which committee are you looking for, Rachel? Right, and you're here to, from, oh, okay, got it, okay. I wasn't sure because nobody explained. Okay, thank you. All right. Yes, no, it's fine. Okay. Before we start talking about the actual recommendations and proposals and how we'd like the subcommittee to function, I'd like to provide sort of a brief background and overview of the program and the main concerns. I don't know if anybody watched the live stream that we had done for the main committee, but some of this was mentioned during the main committee, so some of you may have heard some of this, and for those of you that haven't, then this will just help bring everybody together on the same page. As you're aware, there is a shortage of highly qualified individuals who are teaching in high-need fields and in low-income schools in the United States. So the Teacher Education Assistance for College and Higher Education, which is what we call the real name of the Teach Grant Program, was established by the College Cost Reduction and Access Act in 2007 to help pay for the cost of education for undergraduate and graduate students who are pursuing a career in teaching in high-need subjects in low-income schools. So the hope was that by helping these students finance their educations, this would help increase the number of students in high-need fields and in high-need schools. So specifically, the program aims to increase the number of teachers by providing them $4,000 per year, up to $4,000 per year, to both undergraduate and graduate students who are enrolled to become a teacher in these high-need fields and then in these low-income schools. In exchange for the grants, teachers, and that is the grant recipients, must perform a service obligation in which they teach for 4 years in high-need fields and low-income schools, 4 out of 8 years. They have 8 years to get this done. So we're talking about fields like, for instance, reading specialists, mathematics, or science. But in addition, they need to annually certify that they are either meeting or intend to meet the service obligation. If they do not meet the service obligation, or the annual certification requirements, then what happens is the grant turns into a direct unsubsidized loan with interest accruing from the time of grant disbursement. Teach grants were initially awarded in the 2008-09 school year, so the program has been around for a while. More recently, the issue of Teach grants having their grants converted into loans and in general confusion about how to satisfy program requirements has been very much in the public arena. Think NPR reporting and this sort of thing. There's also been several studies that contributed some information to this. And we have, maybe Linda, do you think maybe we can hand out? They just arrived. We're going to give a couple of these for your perusal later. These include a study that was done recently for the department by AIR, and they provided information for us in this that showed that 2/3 of grant recipients, that is roughly 63, whoops, sorry, that's okay, roughly 63% of students who began their service requirement prior to 2014 ultimately had their teach grants converted into subsidized loans. Additionally, among those teach grant recipients who had their grants converted into loans, about 32% said they did not understand the service requirements. Another 1 in 5 said they did not know about the annual certification process, and 13% said they faced challenges with the certification process. So that's the larger study that we've provided for you. You can peruse it if you have not done so already. And then also with respect to conversions, there was a 2015 GAO study, which we're also going to hand out to you, that found that at that time, meaning at the 2015 timeframe, about 36,000 of the more than 112 Teach Grant recipients did not fulfill grant requirements and had their loans, grants converted into loans. Those are the two we're handing out to you. There is an additional study you may want to take a look at, and if you are interested, we can provide you the link to that later. It's kind of a long study that was done by Public Citizen that was released in December of 20. People are shaking their heads, so everybody knows what I'm talking about. No, maybe. Some people know what I'm talking about, the study from Public Citizen, which is also very comprehensive and provided a lot of documentation and data. So, all of this to say that the department is interested in reducing the grant to loan conversions and in improving program outcomes. So specifically, we're looking to modify or clarify certain regulations that pertain to Teach Grant recipient eligibility, grant administration, grant recipient service obligation fulfillment, and obligation to repay the grant. More specifically, we'd be looking at updating some definitions and additional changes that conform with the statute to certain sections of the Teach Grant program. We will update and clarify application procedures, amend counseling requirements, and amend service obligation requirements as our proposals. Those will be in the red line. And we will be delving into that shortly. But before we do that, there's a couple of housekeeping things that I think we should probably address. Maybe we should start with what I know I've been told we have to do today, which is we have to take lunch between 12 and 1 due to the live streaming requirements. So 12 to 1 we'll have lunch. Would people like to have a break in the morning and one in the afternoon? And if so, around what time should we make that? 10:30, okay. So we'll take a break at 10:30, and in the afternoon, 3-ish, 2:30. Anybody have a preference? 3. There it is. That was easy. So you'll definitely do that. If you have questions about where to eat, or is anybody unfamiliar with this area? Just sort of to ask a little bit. So there's two sort of kind of places you can get food. Our cafeteria is no longer, it's more like a mini mart right now. We used to have a cafeteria here, we no longer do. So there's places across the street. There are some food trucks. There normally would be more food trucks, but there are not as many now as there would be. And you're welcome to bring food back in here if you wanted to not go to some place. So that's not really a concern, but it's more like if you haven't brought something, what would you like to do? So if you have any questions about that as we get closer to lunch, we can offer some suggestions for that. Does it? Okay, good. And then the other question, of course, surrounds how we would like to operate our subcommittee. And what I mean by that is we will have proposals. I will introduce them and explain to you what's going on with them. But once I've done that, how would you like to proceed? Obviously, we would like to have discussion around it, should there be any need for that. And then whether there's agreement, disagreement with the proposal, if there are alternatives to the proposal, whatever that outcome is. But in terms of how we want to prioritize who speaks, do you want to use tens and just turn them up? Do you want to have it more free-flowing? I don't really have a preference. It's more what the committee would prefer. So that was maybe any suggestions for that?
I'll say free flowing seems like a good way to have a conversation, and I think we're all able to
Okay.
defer to each other as needed.
That works fine for me. So the other thing is that we have to decide on a way to interact with the main committee for the main committee's purposes. So as I've already said, we are here to advise and provide recommendations to the main committee. That is sort of our product. To that end, and I've mentioned this, I believe, to pretty much everybody I talked to on the phone except probably, yeah, I don't think I'm having trouble saying the name tag. That's why I was like, Stephen, okay. That we will be looking for a volunteer or volunteers to report back to the committee. And hopefully, people have thought about that. And if there are any volunteers, if you could just sort of volunteer. Okay, Kira, Deborah, any others? Okay, so we have 3 people that are willing to go back to the committee. Do you want to split up how you'd like to do that? Do you want to, any thoughts?
I think some of that will also turn on how our conversations proceed, because I would hope that all the perspectives around the table would be able to be represented to the main committee.
Okay.
Also, I'm assuming it's not going to be on subcommittee days. We'll be on different days than.
Yes.
So for logistical reasons, we might have to make decisions.
Yes. So the way it would work is so it'll depend on what we finally come up with, you know, what will come back from the committee and what we would do to proceed at that point. But so there's actually 4 times, and then if we can just check the times to get to everybody, the next committee meeting and the subcommittee meeting as well. Thank you. You know now? Okay.
February 12th and 13th for the subcommittee meeting, and February 19th to the 22nd for the committee meeting. So we'll be meeting before the committee meeting.
Right. That's where we get the 4. So technically we have 4 times.
Can you repeat that, please? So all of the information about the subcommittee meetings, the committee meetings can be found on ed.gov, but the next subcommittee meeting will be the 12th and the 13th of February, and then the next main committee meeting for accreditation and innovation will be the 19th to the 22nd. So we will be meeting before the next main committee meeting.
What we don't know right now is when during the main committee meeting we would be scheduled. That's what we don't know for obvious reasons.
I was going to ask if it's an expectation that we would present after the 4, because I know originally the schedule was that we have sessions in March as well.
Yes, the idea would be that we would try to get a recommendation in by then, but the idea is then when the main committee meets, if they have additional things for us to do, then we would meet in March. Or for whatever reason, we're not completed with our work and we only present some portion of that, then we would meet in March. So that would be the idea.
I will probably have to rescind my availability. That is our national meeting, and I go out early. So I have to double check before I can fully commit to presenting on the 19th and the 20th, you said it was, for the full committee of February.
So I don't believe that it's been determined the exact date when the subcommittees will be reporting back to the main committee. That's something the main committee will determine. The main committee meeting is the 19th through the 22nd. That's the second meeting. There's still a third main committee meeting in March.
Thanks.
And I'll just say, I'm in town, so happy to assist in any way. Easier than some folks to get here than others, so happy to help.
Thank you for that. Are there any other logistical housekeeping questions that we need to address before we move into our, just so you know what that is, there's construction going on. That's what that is. So on occasion, we have this going on, and there's nothing we can do about that. Yes.
I did want to ask, since you passed out these wonderful studies, if the department has done any other studies since the March 2018 Teach Grant Review.
No, not since that time. Any other questions, comments, concerns before we move on to the review of the department's proposals?
Just to verify, what you submitted today in paper, is that exactly what was sent via email?
You mean?
All the documents?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes,
thank you.
those were the documents that went out to the main committee
Okay.
by email.
Thank you.
That's what I think you're referring to, yes. Okay, thank you. So, sure.
I was not able to watch the full committee. Have they determined the voting and how they're going to address the subcommittees? Are they going to vote on each subcommittee and their proposals independently? Are they rolling the subcommittees into the full package and it's a single vote? Or some other version thereof?
There are going to be 3 buckets of voting. And for the purposes of the Teach Grant program, it will be aligned with the faith-based committee.
Thank you.
Okay. So projected on our screen is the red line that contains our proposals. I want to just briefly talk about the structure of this so that we're all on board on how this works. What we've done is we've provided you with both red lines and summaries, but it's the red lines that are going to be up on the screen because that's where the regulations are. And what we'll be doing here and in their summaries is for those areas where we have changes, that's where the red lines are. We'll go through more or less subpart by subpart to discuss the issues as they are going through the actual proposals that we have made. In terms of discussion, we'll do the free-flowing like we discussed, and if we need other information, alternatives, whatever, we will develop those as well. And again, I apologize for the very annoying construction. So in terms of the regulatory scheme that we have here, Teach is Part 686, and Subpart A discusses the scope, purpose, and general definitions. And the first area where we made changes was actually in 686.1, which is the scope. So what we've done here is we've revised the scope to revise the description of the Teach Grant program to clarify that grant recipients can satisfy the service obligation by serving, in addition to a high need field in a school, we're adding or for an educational service agency serving a low-income students. And we're doing this because we are trying to conform the language to a statutory amendment that was made back in 2008, actually, so it's quite a while back, in the Higher Education Opportunity Act, which amended Section 481F to provide that an educational service agency has the meaning from the elementary from the Every Student Succeeds Act, every Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and further amended Section 465A of the Higher Education Act to include these ESAs in the definition of an eligible school for Perkins teacher cancellation, and then Section 420N of the HEA, which is Teach Grants, states that to satisfy the service obligation, a grant recipient must teach in a school as described in 46A2A. All of this stuff brings us back to the idea that we are going to add educational service agency to the scope for Teach Grants. And we actually will make corresponding changes later on in the document, and we will add the definition later. But this is just to explain to you why that's in here in the scope. We then go on and say that in exchange for the grant, the student must agree to serve as a full-time teacher in a high-need field in a school or an educational service agency serving low-income students for at least 4 academic years within 8 years of ceasing enrollment at the institution where the student received the grant. The current language completing the program of study is actually the statutory language, but we feel that in order to better be more consistent, I guess is the word I want to say, with the regulations as we have them elsewhere, this operationalizes this piece a little bit better for the purposes of the purpose. And in addition to that part, we added or the transfer institution where the student completed the program to be very clear that should a student transfer and complete a program, a Teach Grant eligible program there, that would still be perfectly fine. So we did want to make sure that that piece of it was captured. And then finally, we have one more change that we made. Where we have federal direct unsubsidized Stafford loan, we're changing that reference. It should be just direct unsubsidized loans to match terminology. Something's not right there. Oh, I see. We fix it back here, and then we're going to use it to the front. Federal, see where it says federal / direct unsubsidized loan in parentheses. That's what we're going to be using going forward from this scope and purpose section. Yes.
Is it further or better defined what it means to complete at a transfer institution? What I mean is trying to think from a servicer perspective, what if a student stops out for 4 years and then goes to a transfer institution? It's just something to think about sort of procedurally, that it be pretty clear later.
Yeah. I think for the purpose of the scope, we want to capture this and purpose want to capture the idea, but more operationalizing these things. If there are concerns about it as we get into it further, then that would be where we'd want to capture that. Yes, that's correct.
Do we?
Go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering if under direct unsubsidized loan that we even needed Stafford Ford if we were going to take out the federal and say as a direct unsubsidized loan.
Okay. So I've been told that we're just using the terminology that's in the direct loan regulations.
Could you, I know we're going to discuss this more in depth later, but could you provide an example of a person who would be eligible for a Teach Grant who works at an educational service agency but may not be, a traditional general education teacher or ESL teacher?
Well, the way educational service agencies will generally work is a lot of them will actually just be like the centralized office for whatever schools that they would be reporting to them, let's put it that way. So if that would be very similar, as long as they meet the definition of a teacher and they still work for the ESA, that would be okay. So I don't know if that helps.
When you say centralized office, are you talking about
the ESA? ESAs don't necessarily directly teach. They may have schools that would be under the ESA but are not the ESA directly, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So as long as the teachers are part of that and actually teaching in the manner that we describe as a teacher doing it their service obligation, that would be fine.
So is this like a school administration?
No. They would not be an administrator. They have to meet the definition of a teacher.
Okay. Well, then I'm confused with her. Because at first I was thinking that this is going to open it up to administration offices like, I don't know, in our area, the Madison County School Administrators. They have an office that administrates all of the Madison County schools, but they're not teaching. They're basically training the teachers, or they're administrating the staff at the schools. So I think there might be a little bit of confusion around that if we just say educational service agency.
Let me just
Yes.
Okay, this was a statutory change by Congress, and the explanation we got at the time was that there are teachers who are employed by the Educational Service Agency, not by the school, but they are performing all the, they are acting as a regular teacher. And because they weren't employed by the school, the way we read the statute at the time was that they weren't qualified because they weren't working for the school. So Congress changed the statute here and in the teacher loan forgiveness rules to make them qualified. That's, we're not aware of the extent of that or anything, but that's what we heard from the Hill.
So one example that I can think of, at least locally for me, is we have an intermediate unit, and it services several schools within several districts in our area, and they provide intensive autism programs, and they are actually teaching. And so now they would qualify, whereas currently they don't.
Does that help? Yes.
Yes, I think that helps. However, I know the agencies have run into problems, not just qualifying, but demonstrating that they are meeting the high needs categories. How are we going to make sure that they're still meeting those needs, or that they are serving the classification of students that we're looking for?
I'm not sure if I quite get your question, but the way I would think about it is that as long as the teacher, because the teacher is the one that's doing the service obligation, is meeting those qualifications as we've just described, and the teacher is meeting the obligation of the service requirement.
I think it's been an issue with certification or the annual certification, whereas they are proving that they are teaching or working with the candidates that are of high needs or of low socioeconomic status. And so I'm just a little concerned that we might be fixing one problem, but not necessarily fixing all of the issues that the candidates have had in the past.
I think I know what you mean. So again, our intermediate unit is actually located in my kid's school district, which would not qualify as a low-income district. However, they do service students from neighboring districts that do qualify. So parsing that out, I think, could be difficult.
Do we know how many Teach Grant recipients are actually fitting into this category? Because I think that's a question too, is if it's 3 or if it's,
Well, can you run
more
back
than
through
that.
our numbers one more time? I think you did it the very first, and it was like a large percentage.
The numbers I ran through in the beginning were general. Linda, would you mind taking a note of that if there's any numbers for that? So what I had here was the 32% was Teach Grant recipients who had their grants converted to loans. Oh no, I'm sorry. Of the Teach Grant recipients who had their grants converted to loans, about a third said they did not understand the service requirements. I think that maybe that's what you're after.
Right, and what was the big number there?
The number is 63%. 63% who began service requirements prior to July 2014 ultimately had their grants converted.
And I believe in numbers in the March 2018 report, that was 78,000 Teach Grant recipients.
I mean, I think we can all agree there's clearly some miscommunication, misunderstanding, something here,
Yeah.
because that's a really large number.
That's
I
a
know
large number.
at the institutions of the constituents that shared with me before I arrived, their numbers are concerning. Mm-hmm. And so as a DFA, we're always trying to watch that and try to do better at that. And I just don't, at the counseling, because we don't necessarily always talk to these students on the front end face-to-face. We don't necessarily talk to them on the back end face-to-face. We're relying on the web counseling stuff. And so call it what it is, but they click through, as all my people down here know. They click through and they don't understand. So if we add something like for an educational service agency, I would just like for it to be very clear so that they're not misunderstanding again, oh, I can just opt out and become an administrative assistant, and because I have a teaching degree, and I can have my loans forgiven, I mean, my grant not converted. So I just want to make sure that we're going even beyond to explain that, because 63%, they are clearly not understanding.
So one of the things, and I just wanted to make clear that this is just describing the scope and purpose. And as we go through the regulations, there will be areas that maybe we haven't put information or language in that you can see that would be a good place to further clarify some of these concerns, if we haven't already done so, and or to your satisfaction, whichever way.
I was just going to recommend, if we decide that we want to address the language here, that instead of, it says full-time teacher in a high-need field in a school or for an educational service agency, we could add, or serving as a teacher for an educational
Yes.
service agency. We could. Sure, I'd be fine with that. I'm just, yeah.
Though that, in Alyssa's example from before that raises the question, if they're a full-time teacher, but they're full-time teaching, it is not all within a low-income school. Like, is there a certain threshold of service in a low-income school or schools that then they meet the requirements? So is it at least 50% in low-income schools or something like that?
If there's one student in my classroom from a low-income school, does that still fulfill my obligation? Because they're largely blended classrooms.
Yeah, we have definitions, or they have to, there's only certain schools that qualify, and we'll get to those later. It's a little bit, thank you. There are only certain schools that would qualify, and those are listed in the teacher cancellation list. We'll get to all this later, but yeah, they can't just be anywhere. There are very specific requirements for the types of schools that actually would qualify for this particular
So when it's
obligation.
blended, then that would be, we'll address that later too?
We don't have any proposal to that, but if you see something that would make sense, then by all means, we would want to talk about it. Remember, these are our proposal, this is a starting point for us. And so some things, I would just say some things are statutory. So for instance, this is statutory, so we have to have it here. Now, what we can massage around that, around the edges, is that's kind of a slightly different thing. But we are definitely required to have the ESAs in as part of the grant.
I would like to ask a global question of the group.
Yes.
Because the grant to loan conversion has been so high, I would ask that in the broader purpose of these regulations, we also consider what remedies will be offered to teach grant recipients who have had their grants convert in error.
Do you have specific language?
Let's see. It would probably be if the student does not satisfy the service obligation, the amounts of the teach grant receives are treated as federal direct unstaffordized loans unless the grant has been, and must be repaid with interest unless the grant has been converted in error.
I would like to add an error by the servicer, just because a student could anyone could interpret that as an error anywhere.
I will say, after talking to teachers, there have been, I've spoken with folks who have gotten their grants converted because of a missed date or a misunderstanding about what constitutes the last day of school. They received the form back from their servicer. They completed the form correctly, resubmitted it, and then were denied. They not only lost credit for the service year, but they had their entire grant convert. And so there it's a question of, is it the student's issue or is it the servicer's error that ultimately converted the grant? So that's the only
No,
reason
I
push
agree with
level.
that concern, and trying to be student-centric. I just don't want to make it even more confusing or cloud the waters at all. So somehow.
I think there has to be some level of, I think a lot of that is cleared up if they understand, like if they understood more of the details. But unlike you, I don't necessarily want to open it up to say, oh, I forgot about that, I went on vacation and I mailed it late, but I meant to. I think we're going to get very gray on that if we don't tighten it up and then just kind of clean up the definitions and the service obligations.
Maybe we could add the word determined to be converted in error. That gives a hint that there's a process and a procedure, that it's not just willy-nilly, for lack of a better term.
And this is also the scope and purpose section, so hopefully as we move forward, we can flesh out some of this a bit further.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, this is providing the general information about the grant, and then as we go on, we will operationalize things more and more, and hopefully we'll get to some of these concerns.
Excuse me, is this the place where I would bring up, it says must be repaid with interest. Is the interest retroactively accrued because we don't have that here? Or should we even put that in this particular section?
I don't think there's any harm if you feel like that. I don't feel there's any harm if you feel like you'd like to propose some language, then by all means propose some language and we will all look at it.
I believe that language is farther down here, so we would want to use exactly the same wording, so we could come back to that maybe, because I don't want to propose something and then it be
Okay.
restated.
Okay.
Actually, I was just about to say the same thing, because and I think in the scope and purpose section is really important because it's upfront, that it's from the date of each Teach Grant disbursement is the language later on. I think that's important.
The only thing, I was just thinking that it might be more important for us to put in parentheses where that's found later on in the grant, as opposed to repeating the same language.
Okay. So you're saying just cross-reference it to that?
Reference it to the section.
He's gonna, our friendly Tuck is gonna yell at me again. Any other comments or discussion about this section?
Can I just ask a protocol question? When we are all done today and we have this wonderful additional markup that's been added to the document, will that be circulated to all of us so we can bring it back to our constituents?
Well, I guess that would be all right. This is a proposal only, though. That's the only thing I want to make clear.
This is currently being broadcast on the live stream, and the live stream will be uploaded to YouTube. So I wouldn't see any issue with distributing it because it will be permanently online anyway.
But I think what you're asking for is you want a copy of this. I think that's what.
Yes.
That's what.
Sophia, not to belabor the point, but where we have in parentheses right now the direct unsubsidized loan, can that replace what we currently have right before that, where it says federal direct unsubsidized Stafford/Ford loan? Can it say direct unsubsidized loan and then Stafford Ford, based on the question we had earlier?
Do we even need the parentheses?
Right. I'm saying eliminate the parentheses, because in essence, we're repeating ourselves there. And it leads to a little bit of confusion as to why we're emphasizing that. So I would just say where it says treated as, and then state what we have in parentheses. And then you can still add Stafford Ford loan.
The official name of the program is the Federal Direct Unsubsidized Stafford Ford Loan Program. We do this regularly in our regs to provide a shortened version, direct unsubsidized loan. As a matter of drafting, for purposes of the Federal Register, we have to do it this way. Yeah. So we define it. We define the shortened term in the scope in numerous places in the regulations. Not necessarily the most easy to read, but it's
Not the most efficient way, but I understand. Thank you.
Essentially, we're establishing a shorthand for it here.
Perhaps this is better to operationalize later, but the change to ceasing in enrollment. So in an example of if someone completes a bachelor's but goes directly into a master's, is that completion of a bachelor's a cease of enrollment? Is that break, is that, even if it's just a one-day break, is that considered a cease in enrollment? Or if they continue directly onto the master's, are they continuously considered to be continuously enrolled in what's described here?
Well, you have two different things going on here because you have two different grants going on. The question really, I think, is more of how is that going to get counted later? And we do have language related to how we're going to count things later. So maybe look at it at that point and don't forget that point so that we can, if we need to make any adjustments here, then we can, or the other way, we can touch base on.
Along those lines, I'm not sure that it addresses how to treat less than half-time enrollment. Is that considered ceasing, or can a student who is maybe taking just one credit to get through something, does that begin the clock or not? I didn't really see that in here anywhere.
That's an interesting question, and let's talk about that when we get to those pieces.
And how is maternity leave qualified here?
And how do you mean, how do we count it?
Yes, is that a cease, when you start talking about the 8 years and counting the 8 years, if that is part of the individual's background?
We have ways that you can get suspensions and that sort of thing, so that we can talk about that as we go through this as well. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just a little bit concerned about dropping the program of study.
Okay.
And it may just be me, but I'm thinking ceasing enrollment at the institution or the transfer institution, can they just jump from program to program and that's still enrollment? Or does it have to be the teacher? Because I don't think when we said program of study here, it was very specific. And ceasing enrollment in a qualified program of study, maybe, I don't know if we just want to leave that open or if it's even a concern.
Fine there where the student received the grant. Now, whether a student stays in the specific Teach Grant eligible program that they started, and as long as they're in a Teach Grant eligible program and the institution is Teach Grant eligible, they can move around within the teaching, taking the coursework in a Teach eligible program. Really the hook is what are they doing for the obligation. The hook is what are they doing once they graduate and they start teaching, because we all know that sometimes students change their minds and move from one. That's very common. So that's sort of not really the big concern. The big concern is that when they get out, that they're teaching in a Teach Grant in a program that would be eligible. High need field in a low-income school. So as long as they are within a Teach Grant eligible institution, they can move to other Teach Grant eligible programs.
I don't think we have that here.
Well, but we have it elsewhere because we have like student eligibility, institution eligibility, we have all this stuff. The scope describes what the program is. So we wouldn't be doing everything here. We were just kind of generally talking about what would be included as part of that program, how the program is supposed to operate or work.
One thing we may want to consider as a small addition, as you read it, you'll see we have here within 8 years of ceasing enrollment at the institution where the student received the grant or the transfer institution where the student completed the program. I don't know if it would be valuable to add something along the lines of whichever comes later. But that may provide a small amount of clarity. That there's agreement to that.
You like that?
I think that may bring up an issue. What if I go back to school 8 years after I used, and now it's converted, but then I complete at a transfer institution, now that is later, then what?
Can we table that until we are able to go through all of those finer distinctions? Because I see what you're saying in terms of trying to make it clear, but there are so many cases where how all of that is sliced will
Yeah, fair enough.
You know, I appreciate not wanting to define and operationalize everything in this one paragraph. That being said, if this is whoever's reading it, if it's the reader's first read, it sets their reading frame, which then influences how they read everything else, or how they actually don't read other things, and then might miss important pieces of information. So I think maybe coming back to this after we go through everything, and think, does this set that frame for people to clearly understand what's following?
Yes, I think that makes a lot of sense.
And then a process question as we, I don't know if we addressed this as we started, but is our intent for the next 4 sessions to sort of go section by section here? I know in the past, in negotiated rulemaking sessions, there's been an opportunity to sort of have a broader conversation, and then the department would go back and address some of those issues and put language then back on the table. And so I appreciate that we're starting with something. I think that's helpful to some degree. But I'm just wondering sort of what you envision as the next 4 days.
So initially, the idea would be to go through our proposal, and again, it is our starting point to see how we do. Meaning, you know, what changes should we make, if any? Do you like everything? I mean, we've already started making changes here. So once we're gone through our proposal, and that is our charge, so that we have a recommendation for the main committee. If there's other things that we haven't addressed that you feel we ought to be talking about in a more broader frame, by all means, I think that absolutely we should have that conversation. But in the interest of having a product that the main committee will need in order for them to move forward in the negotiation, we're not voting, we're recommending, we're an advisory group. So they will need that information. So I think because of that, we do have to prioritize that work and then move on to any other work. I don't know if that helps explain the sort of process.
I would like to raise, though, just because it wasn't included in the proposed changes, I do think it's very important for the subcommittee to discuss what remedy will be provided to the 78,000 teachers who have already had their grants convert and what regulations would govern that process. So I would just like to add that as a discussion topic because I think that is as important as the service issues going forward.
I totally agree.
Completely agree.
I definitely think at the end of the regs, there's an opportunity to engage on that. So it's still within, I hope, the work product that we'll take forward.
Yeah, I think we need to go through this first and then return back to any unresolved issues, anything we feel we need to discuss. I mean, we as the subcommittee are tasked with not just looking at this, but making recommendations. So we can make recommendations. That having been said, we are not voters. The main committee can accept, reject, modify, whatever they decide to do. So I just want to make that very clear so that going forward, there's no confusion about that. Any other concerns about point 1 before we move to point 2 definitions? Great. Okay. So, coincidentally, our first definition is for educational service agency. So we need to go to that definition. And basically, that's the definition that was added.
Out of curiosity, is that the definition in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or is that definition referenced anywhere in any other regulations? I didn't have time to check on that.
To my knowledge, it's only in the ESCA. Do you know if it's anywhere else?
Is it something where it might be helpful to cite the law? where it's found, so that people know it's not just a made up like definition.
Does that help?
Is this the section where we should further attempt to define a qualifying ESA or not? What I mean by that is,
No.
do they?
We will go back to the schools that would, how you become qualified under the list.
So that would come later?
Yeah. So, any other discussion on this definition besides adding the citation?
Can I actually ask a broader question?
Yeah.
In the summary, there was a note that one of the intentions behind some of the proposed changes was to include private school teachers who were teaching in low-income schools.
Yes.
Was this a change that was intended to produce that effect as well, or no? This was purely
This was purely
Such-
legislative.
okay.
Yeah. Okay. All right, let's move on then to the next definition. Or actually, yes. In the definition of high-need field, we have made a small change. We have struck in accordance with 34 CFR 682.210Q. The reason we did this is because we thought this was now unnecessary, because we only really, down the road, you will see, refer to the teacher shortage area nationwide listing as being sufficient, rather than having to do all the follow through on all the information here. That the teacher shortage area listing actually just takes care of it. I don't know if that makes sense what I'm saying, but I see people nodding. So this is kind of a very small change. Makes it cleaner and clearer, I think. And then the next one is highly qualified. So we understand now that we have the Every Student Succeeds Act, but for Teach Grant purposes, we are required to use the term highly qualified, which is associated back to the Elementary and Secondary Act. It turns out that Section 9214A of the ESSA provides that for Title IV HA Federal Student Aid programs, the term highly qualified is defined in the law the day before enactment of the ESSA continues to apply.
Could you state that section again, please?
Yes. It is 9214A of the ESSA. So because of that, we thought it would be helpful to actually put that definition directly in here, so it wouldn't be confusing. We did add, in addition to putting the definition in from high quality, this is also the section in which we have, for consistency again with the highly qualified definition used for the purposes of the direct loan teacher loan forgiveness program, we've added language to cover private school teachers, and we've put that in for I and double I. So this section here, at the end of the definition of high quality, states that when used with respect to any private school teacher who is exempt from state certification requirements, means that the teacher is permitted to and does satisfy rigorous knowledge and skills tests by taking competency tests in the applicable grade levels and subject areas. And then for purposes of this, in this definition, the competency tests taken by a private school teacher must be recognized by 5 or more states for the purpose of fulfilling the highly qualified teacher requirements described in paragraphs 1, 2, and 3 of this definition, and the score achieved by the teacher on each test must equal or exceed the average passing score of those 5 states.
this may not be an issue, however, it seems as though highly qualified addresses how to classify a public school teacher and a private school teacher, but not somebody in an educational service agency.
Are you, just to clarify, are you saying that there should be some language related to educational service agency within this definition?
I would think so.
Do you have some proposed language?
Not at the not off the cuff, no. Just seems like if we're going to be including those people, then how do you make sure that they're highly qualified when it's very specific to public and then private, but not the educational assistance agency?
Do others have thoughts about this?
I would agree. I would agree we need to address that at some point to determine, because they may or may not be taking these same tests. They may
Right.
be qualified by some other means.
And I don't know that I know enough about the field, but if we could maybe just incorporate educational service agency right in number 1, when used with respect to any public elementary school or secondary school teacher, something like as well as those teaching within an educational service agency.
Thoughts?
So it seems like those are two different questions, though, or statements. If we're going to just add educational service agency here, that would mean that this would be sufficient for them to be considered highly qualified, which I don't have a problem with, considering what the definition is a little bit further up for educational service agents.
A question for those who know more in the K-12 world. My question is, as in 4.1 and 2, as we think about private school teachers, there's a reference to any private school teacher who is exempt from state certification requirements. Is there, or are there instances where a teacher in an educational service agency would ever be exempt from state certification requirements, which would then make some of the processes that we've described under 1 more difficult?
Very good question.
That's exactly my point, in that it may not be that they fit, the ESAs necessarily fit the public school definition, and they may not all fit the private school definition. But they may be a mix of both, or they may be
I would
something
agree.
completely
Yeah.
different.
And I don't think I know enough to even propose language for that, honestly. But I think we do need to cover it, otherwise how do you know that they're highly qualified?
So should we make a note to come back to this after we've had some more conversation? And I wonder if there's a way, Erin, that we can quickly highlight things that we want to come back to so that we can circle back without having to scroll for everything. Yeah, I think that would be good.
Is ESA listed in other programs that are currently operational, so we have a better sense of the scope of teaching positions that are covered within that definition?
I would imagine it's covered in elementary and secondary kinds of programs, but we work with higher ed, so would not have. Oh yeah, teacher loan forgiveness, that's right.
I have another addition or question. So where would a public charter school teacher who is exempt from state certification requirements fit within this definition of highly qualified?
Can you repeat that one more time?
Where would a public charter teacher who is exempt from state certification requirements, where would they fit here? Who is exempt from state certification requirements? It's actually sort of a mix, because there are some that would be certified and some not. Some who would be required to be certified and some who would not be required to be certified.
Might I suggest that where we're going, it seems to me like maybe where we're going, on 4I, when it says, when used with respect to any private school teacher who is exempt from state requirements, could we just insert there any private school teacher or other public school teacher or ESA that may not qualify under the previous definition? If we just kind of put that there, then it kind of makes it where it's either or. They can qualify either way. Am I making sense?
Yes.
Well, the only problem with that is, I mean, we either are recommending that there is a certain status that goes along with highly qualified, or we're not. It seems like we've put a lot of energy into saying what is highly qualified, and then we back end and say, or you can not be, and you can teach in these other areas. So I just think we need. I would caution us to change that part of the language, and I think if we just add educational service agency at the top, as initially proposed, then that would solve and say that all of the individuals will have to be highly qualified as by the definition we've used prior. And it would also give us an opportunity, if there is some additional language, that we can add that language to this as opposed to subverting the language that's already here.
Okay, so then, and I may just be blocking something here, but then we would still keep 4I for private school teachers only, or would we say teachers not otherwise, teachers otherwise exempt from state requirements?
Yeah, that would make either that or saying private, public, or other school teacher. Either way, I think would help.
Maybe this is a section just in general that we can continue to think about and perhaps collect some additional research or through outreach as well as we're thinking about different requirements, because I really agree with the comments from Willis as we're thinking about creating a lot of hoops for certain teachers, and then on the back end, for others, there's not as many hoops, and I think for me, I think it's a priority to ensure that all teachers are created equally here, in the sense that to get on a soapbox, but that public school teachers have a process that's easy to explain in the same way as private school teachers and public charter school teachers, and other teachers that I'm not capturing in those statements. So.
I'm going to disagree just a bit, because I think what I'm reading, and I could be just scanning quickly, but what I'm reading is that the state certification requirements kind of do a lot of the testing. And so we're just taking that at the state's word. You're highly qualified based on your state requirements. And then we're allowing for the teachers who teach in an area, whether it's an ESA or a private school, who don't have to meet the state requirements. We're actually just allowing for an exemption for them to take the state's test and be eligible. I think that's all we're doing. I don't think we're giving them an out. We're just saying, if you teach in a place that doesn't make you take the test, we're going to make you take the test to become eligible. That's kind of how I'm reading it.
I didn't quite read it that same way, Debbie. Let me say two things. The first is that when you look at the requirements of the state, it's typically because the national accrediting bodies for teacher education have suggested certain processes for licensure. And so it's not necessarily the state, it's a national group that is saying that this is best practice. Now, rather, I agree with the testing, and how much testing is going on is something different. But we want to, I think, going back to what Stephen's point is, try to make sure we're as consistent as possible. And I think if we say this is what highly qualified is somewhere else, we have to say this is highly qualified here. And then on top of that, when you start talking about adding the educational agencies or service agencies, we want to say that the individuals still want to be certified. And I think the language in the earlier, I think it's that I, the first 1I gives us some example as to how you can how you can be highly qualified through a process. And if we just add the information earlier as I think Allison was saying, of educational service agencies also meeting those, being part of that standard in one for elementary and secondary, and then also add them as another group, then you're still allowing all of this to help identify or describe what highly qualified is. Does that make sense? And so I think you're still giving them the opportunity to be classified in different ways, but still capturing the definition of highly qualified or being highly qualified.
Oh, but I also do think that there is still a bifurcation, as you kind of pointed out, and it starts on 4. Not to belabor the point, but I do think we need to add, it should read something like, when used with respect to any private, public, or other school teacher who is exempt from state. That way, like to your point, if they are teaching at a charter school that maybe doesn't require certification, they could fall into this bucket and qualify in that way.
I wanted to come back to the charter school. There is the language, and I address what you were asking earlier.
I didn't think so, or I don't think so, because the way I read that is basically then, as long as you're a teacher in a charter school, then you qualify, because it's just saying, as long as you teach there. I mean, that's what it says. So that's why, to me, this doesn't meet the definition of highly qualified.
So this part is literally copied from the definition of highly qualified. I'm not sure what else to say about that. That's the definition that's given.
Do we have a way to remedy that with respect to the Teach Grant, or do we have to copy paste?
Well, we're required to use that as defined. Are you asking, can we make additional requirements?
Well, so I guess then, so 4 is an addition. So can it be added? Can it be added to 4 as a way to remedy what is in ESSA?
Can you give us some language of what you mean specifically?
So what Alyssa suggested before with 4.1, when used with respect to any private school, public charter school, educational service.
Well, I think it's not exactly represented up there, but I think with respect to any private, public, or other school teacher who is exempt
Yes.
from state certification would then really capture anyone.
Thank you.
Everybody good with that as a proposal?
Except could we just have, it should read from the beginning, when used with respect to any private, public. If you're a fan of the Oxford comma, you can use it there, or other school teacher, and then get rid of the other blue verbiage. Thank you.
And I would like to, go ahead. I wanted to add, to properly reflect the definition that's in the law that around private, it's actually nonprofit private schools, and I'd like to put that word nonprofit in front of the word private, and anywhere throughout this definition where we talk about the private schools, and that's for 65A of HEA or something like that. I think it's straight up 465A where you'll find that. And it's very specific. It's a nonprofit private.
That was 465.
A.
Per 465.
Yeah.
That's just for us to remember.
Just a clarification.
It's further in if you want.
Just for, so I know that I'm thinking it's what I'm thinking it is. Competency test, is that something like the Praxis? And it would exclude, though, many states have, like New York has state-based exams. They don't participate in Praxis. So because in the second part, you'd have to have at least 5 states utilizing it, it would actually exclude a New York State teacher who fits that definition from taking the New York State exam. They'd have to take something like Praxis. That's my reading of it. I just wanted to see if that's I'm seeing nods. So I'm thinking that's a consistent reading.
Yeah, I think this definition is old enough that it was around before all of the variations and all of the changes that we've seen.
So is it okay the way it is, or?
As long as I'm reading it correctly, then yes. I'm not suggesting it needs to be changed. I just want to make sure that I'm interpreting it correctly.
No, but remember, it's that it has to be recognized by faculty.
But I would hope in education communications that would also be relayed to students, because that would be very confusing for Teach Grant recipients in New York State.
Exactly, and that's where I'm a big fan of not everything needs to be in regulation. There's guidance. And so that might be a guidance matter.
But also, again, in those cases, they are still certified, right? Those in New York are still certified.
What I'm saying is if I'm a teacher in New York who fits the definition of 4.1, and so I'd have to demonstrate my highly qualified status by taking one of these exams, I would want to make sure I don't take the New York State exam, because it might actually be quite intuitive to take the New York State exam, but that actually would not qualify me. I'd have to take at least 5 state exam. So again, I think it can be handled in guidance, but
I think that's a good point. We should make a note of that, that's something we would have to consider in guidance. Because I think you're right, most people would not think of that. They would intuitively just go to their state exam. That makes complete sense. Anything else? Good.
Sophia, I'm not sure I'm clear on that last part. Are we, I guess, are we suggesting that someone that is interested in providing the service to a New York community that meets the high needs expectations here, that that individual would need to take another exam or do something else other than go through a certifying process in New York in order to be considered highly qualified? And is that our intent? Is that what we're really seeking to do?
I think that's what, in my read, that's what 4 is all about. It's for that population of teachers who are exempt from state certification requirements. It gives them a route to be identified as highly qualified. So that's the whole purpose I see of this number.
And also, yes, they would have to take an additional test that they wouldn't normally have to in order to teach in New York, but yet to qualify for Teach Grant. Yes.
Did that explain it? You looked a little bit.
I guess there's still a little unreadiness because from our earlier conversation, it was that the individuals, though, that were, they would have already gone through a certification process. They were already qualified in some way. to meet the demands of that particular community, if they were certified. But are we saying now that someone that just, I don't know, comes into the state after the fact, got a teach grant in another state, and wanted to service a community in New York, that they don't already meet the qualifications because their certification is not transferable to New York? Is that what I'm understanding?
I would say no. I think if they do take a qualifying test anywhere, it would meet the obligation, correct me if I'm wrong, but it would meet the obligation of the Teach Grant. But a student who chose to begin their teaching career in New York and only took the New York test would have to come up with some other way to fulfill the highly qualified. I think you're kind of touching a little bit on preemption, and so we have this federal standard of highly qualified and then a state standard, and we're not really trying to rely on the state standard. That's why we've got the definition built in. Is that accurate?
Well, I was just trying to clarify that highly qualified in New York, which meets the certification standards for New York, that person would be highly qualified in Virginia? And you're saying
No.
Well, I mean, the example I have in mind, so someone completes a teach-eligible program in a New York State institution, but they do not get a New York State certification for whatever reason. They go and teach in a private Catholic school, for example, where they're not certified. Number 4 gives them a route to then be teach eligible in terms of their service being eligible by taking a competency test, which would not be the New York State certification exam, would instead be something like Praxis. So that's a particular example to illustrate what's in my mind. I think you might have a different example.
I mean, I think that's a pretty good example.
Okay.
Just want to be sure. Okay. So, our next definition that we have provided edits to is school or educational service agency serving low-income students. And then in parentheses, we have called it low-income school. Okay, just making sure that's there. So here we've added the term again, educational service agencies, to this term to make it clear that the term does include schools serving low-income students. Then we have updated we've deleted 1 and 2, and instead we have that, if you go back to the top, school or educational service agencies serving low-income students, an elementary school, secondary school, or educational service agency that is listed in a department's teacher cancellation low income TCLI directory. So here what we're doing is we're updating the name of the department's directory of low-income schools. This is a directory that lists schools that, in the case of Teach Grants, would be eligible schools for students to perform their service obligation in. And then we have simplified the definition again by removing this unnecessary text that's up top, retaining only the requirement that the school or ESA is listed in the directory. So you've deleted language, renamed the listing, and then made this specific to the listing. Does that make sense?
Have they always listed ESAs in this directory? Just a question that I have.
I think that answer is yes, isn't it? I think the answer, I believe that answer is yes.
Okay, I'm just asking because there's students currently using Teach that maybe it wouldn't have been listed at that point in time.
I actually think
now.
it is listed. Yeah, I think they
Okay.
have been listed.
And this question comes from my lack of knowledge in this. But in the example Alyssa gave earlier about an ESA that is not itself designated as low income, but a teacher from that ESA is primarily serving low income students in other districts or other schools that are designated. Like, I guess, and maybe there's a way that this is all remedied within this TCLI. I just don't know.
I think that's a really good question. It would be interesting to know how they classify the ESA. Is it based on region, or is it based on students that they serve, or how are they coming up with that classification?
I'm just looking at, I happen to have a little thing here on teacher cancellation info directory, and there's a fact, and it asks, what factors do states use to determine if a school is eligible to be a low-income school? To be included in the TCLI directory, a school must meet the following criteria. School must be a public or other nonprofit elementary or secondary school. Must be in a school district of an LEA that is eligible each year for assistance under Title I of the SEA. Number of children enrolled in the school who meet a measure of poverty under Section 113AF of the SEA must exceed 30% of the total enrollment of that school. And it does discuss ESCAs being eligible in here. So
Do you know if that's referencing 20 USCA 1087 EE, which is the basis for the teacher loan forgiveness program, and I think is the statutory basis?
I was going to say, I have the statute in hand because I'm that person. And so under the loan forgiveness, in terms of, I'll just read the whole thing to make you all suffer through. A full-time teacher for the service in an academic year, including such a teacher employed by an education service agency, and then there's a hyphen, I, small I that is, in a public or other nonprofit, private, elementary, or secondary school, which for the purposes of this paragraph and for that year, hyphen, Roman numeral, Roman I, capital Roman I, has been determined by the Secretary pursuant to regulations of the Secretary after consultation with the state educational agency of the state in which the school is located. Yeah, I know. To be a school in which the number of children meeting a measure of poverty under Section 1113A5 of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 exceeds 30% of the total number of children enrolled in the school, and Roman numeral II, capitalized that is in the school district of a local education agency which is eligible in such year for assistance pursuant to Part A of Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, or in one or more public or nonprofit private elementary schools or secondary schools or locations operated by an educational service agency that has been determined by the Secretary pursuant to regulations of the Secretary and after consultation with the state education agency of the state in which the education service agency operates, to be a school or location at which the number of children taught who meet a measure of poverty under Section 1113A5 of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act exceeds 30% of the total number of children taught at such locations.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Page 514. If you'd like to know where to look it up online, yes, I'm that person.
it's very nice to have that person. Any other questions on this piece?
I do have one. Is the TCI, it's an annually updated database, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I've been reminded that it's 10:30 and we agreed to take a break at 10:30. So shall we take a 15-minute break? Does that sound about right? Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a nice break. I see we have a special guest. This is our acting. Well, repeat the whole.
Secretary, Deputy Assistant Secretary, just for a few.
Diane Jones.
Thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. I know this is a lot of work. The subcommittee work is in many ways far more detailed and nitty-gritty than what the full committees will do, because you guys are really diving into some of the tricky issues. So we appreciate that you're here, appreciate the work that you're going to do. I think that the census, and so I think that gives you a little more latitude. So in many ways, I think this is, I don't know, probably a little bit more fun. So appreciate that you're doing it. Know that it's really hard work, but really important work. So thanks.
Thank you, Diane, and I hope everybody had a nice break and is ready to continue on our walk through the regulations. So can we move now that the definitions for school or educational service agency serving low-income students was the last definition, and so we can, if we are completed with our discussion with that, we can move into the next section, which involves the application procedures. Seeing no objection, shall we move on? So this is subpart B. Oh, go ahead. No, no worries.
I was just going back and looking at that definition, and I think, and that's the one where we were just finishing with the low-income TCLI directory part in it. So are there education service agencies operated by BIE? Because in that, the text was added in, and educational service agencies operated by Bureau of Indian Affairs. I just wondered if there were. Do we know? Is that necessary?
I don't know if there are ESAs operated by the BIE, but the other language where we do discuss the Secretary considers all elementary and secondary schools operated by the BIE and the Department of Interior, et cetera. That language is accurate. The addition of the ESA, maybe we should add and or. Would that maybe help?
I just wanted to make sure we weren't just adding things in to have it there. Like if they didn't operate educational service agencies, did we need to have it?
Well,
I'm not opposed to it being there. I'm just sort of like change for change.
I don't know
sake,
that they
but-
do, but I mean, in the event that it ever happened, they would have it there. So I would err on inclusiveness in this case.
Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Sure. Let's turn to B, the application procedures. That's subpart B. And let's talk about the application. So there is no actual Teach Grant application. The application is actually the FAFSA. That is what we use. However, in the existing regulations, we discuss this application that we don't have. So our thought was to replace all of that language with the FAFSA. And so to that end, what we've done is we've specifically called out the FAFSA, where we ask students to complete the FAFSA and submit it. And then we continue on with completing and sign an agreement to serve. Yes, it does say or repay there, and we will talk a little bit about that down the road in 612. and then provide any additional information and assurances requested by the secretary. So the big change is really just then taking the FAFSA, and as you look through the rest of the regulation, anytime we discuss an application, we've now crossed that language out and instead put in the FAFSA. Any discussion on that?
So schools who perhaps took this language literally and created a teach grant application to have within the student's file in order to comply with the letter of the law, are they still allowed to use that if they want to or not?
You mean in lieu of the teach grant application? I mean, in lieu of the FAFSA?
No,
for the teach grant?
in addition.
Well, they can have, if it's an institutional decision to have an additional application, they're certainly welcome to do it. They don't need to, because officially for the purposes of the teach grant, it is the FAFSA.
But it would be okay for them to continue that practice?
As long as the student is filling out the FAFSA.
Okay, thank you.
Is there a drop-down menu when a student is, so I assume they submit their FAFSA report, they get their eligibility for various types of aid, and the teach grant would come up. Is there something, some sort of informational pop-up window that can come up before they accept a teach grant in addition to the agreement to serve, so that their obligations are very clear for them during the application process?
So the way I understand it is that the agreement to serve is a separate document that is completed as a separate entity on to itself in the event that a student selects the teach grant as one of their aid that they use. Characterizing that at all?
The agreement to serve isn't even available for a student to complete until a school originates a teach grant award. So as the student, you can't just go out and do an agreement to serve prior
Right,
to being
that's what I'm-
approved
yes.
by your school.
So I'm a little bit confused though, because it would show up on a student's FAFSA return, I guess, in terms of what they're eligible for?
No.
No?
Eligibility is determined by the school within the parameters set forth regulatorily.
So to further explain, like at our institution, we identify who may be eligible based on the criteria, the GPAs, the program of study, all that. We award them a pending teach grant. So if they opt to use that, they complete the agreement to serve. And that's how we get their permission, acceptance, etc.
And to show you how much variety there is within schools, we do not do that. We have a teach grant application because we used to need one. And the student can complete that application, at which point in time we would check their eligibility and then originate the award.
And I've served at 3 different institutions, and our process has been very similar to yours, Ashley. But at our institutions, many of those individuals would have already had to be admitted into a teacher education program in order for that school to even consider them moving forward. So I'm a little concerned about this process because it takes some of that conversation out of it, and that's partly a good thing to make it easier to obtain. However, it does cause some confusion if the candidate doesn't know what those other obligations, and they haven't talked to anyone about the obligations related to the teach grant.
And so maybe as part of this conversation, we have that discussion, because exactly what Willis is referring to here is what we've witnessed at this institution that I'm at now, and 2 others of my constituents I talked to, in trying to make it easier for the student, like just fill out the FAFSA. You don't have to come in and talk to anyone. We see an uptick in that number of teach grants converted to loans because we don't have as much interaction. We do have more recipients, but we also, not necessarily correlation, but it was an uptick in our conversion rate.
And they went through all the required counseling and
The online counseling, the FAFSA, It's just what I described. Our education department advocated that we would let them know when they were eligible, which we did, and not require the paper document and the face-to-face counseling. And so once we just let them know they were eligible, then a lot of it is just accepting this responsibility online. And as I mentioned earlier, the click, 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 got it, got my $4,000, I'm ready to go. And I think that's why we see those numbers, even if it's not the 68%. But I think that is a definite correlation to why we see those numbers of students who did not know there was even a service agreement, who did not know what the obligation was, who did not know how to, get.
So they just signed the service agreement without any?
Nothing.
I also would like to flag, I've spoken with Teach Grant recipients who found the Teach Grant program themselves. They did not have the benefit of your institutions letting them know that they were even eligible. They relied on the information that was available on the department's website, and then had no idea that if they didn't complete the annual certification form and things like that, that their grant would be converted. And they also, because they didn't have a person-to-person conversation, one teacher I spoke with didn't realize that teaching in a high-need position was a term of art under the Teach Grant. From her perspective, she was like, I'm teaching in a low-income school. Every position is high need. We never have enough teachers to fill all the positions. And so without the website being cross-listed with the term of art, intuitively teachers aren't, they're dealing with a million things and a million pieces of paper. And so it's completely sympathetic and empathetic to me that they would just click, click, click.
What would you recommend?
Well, I'm very supportive of it being an easier process to go directly into the FAFSA process. I think is beneficial to the candidate. I just think we have to worry about what's on the back end to make sure that there's adequate support for the candidate to make a good decision before the award is finalized.
So that's kind of why I was asking if an application would still be allowable. And Stephen brought up a good point, is would it be interpreted as allowable later?
What do you mean by allowable later?
Well, for instance, with entrance counseling, we're not allowed to, unless we're part of a special program, we're not allowed to require annual entrance counseling because that sort of stands in the way of eligibility, and it's not written that way in the rules. So if we're removing the application requirement here, yet retaining it at our school, would that be found to not be compliant?
As an impediment.
So we just had a little quick conference here, and we think that to cover that situation that you've described, we can add that, again, I have to put these on. So complete and sign an agreement to serve or repay is B. C would be provide any additional information and assurances requested by the secretary and the institution.
I like that, and I think that's a good idea. For us, it is very important, and it provides that touch point where we can reemphasize that it could end up, becoming a loan and all of those important things that we're here talking about now. So,
how does everybody else feel about that?
Absolutely, I agree.
And it's schools, just so you know, and I'm confident in saying this, we're not trying to throw roadblocks up. We're doing it to be an additional service and touch point to the student, not to make it more difficult. That would not be our intent.
And to get this on the record for the primary committee to hear, and to those who will be presenting this, I can see where a lot of people may think this is an impediment to offering aid to the people who need it the most. But I think across the board here, the consensus is this is consumer protection. This is more in consumer protection because just the web-based applications are not meeting the information requirement.
And finally, it wouldn't be required anyway. It's just an allowance. So
I'm just thinking about, do we want and or do we want or? Because and becomes a requirement, and if they're, I don't want to limit in either way. I could see benefits to both, and I could see downfalls to both. Because some institutions, if you have an or there, they may or may not decide to have that application. But if you have an and, it becomes a requirement. So
I'm not sure that it
I don't think
because
it
it's
can be
not a
an or.
specific statement. So I think and is fine.
And I don't think it can be an or because the institution would not supersede any additional
Right,
information
from
coming
the secretary.
from the
So I think
secretary.
and should remain.
I do wonder, though, just because students are still relying on department information, if the department would be willing to go through an annual review of the information that is publicly available to make sure that it is still accurate and that it may be addressing any operational issues that have come up, reflecting, of course, these upcoming changes and things like that. So students who then are leaving the counseling and maybe out in the field and now have a question have a clear place where they can get an answer.
And consumer tested.
And consumer tested, exactly.
So just to be clear, you're suggesting a website of some sort that would, I'm not following exactly what you're suggesting.
So right now on the education website, there is information about the Teach Grant. There is the entrance and exit counseling, paper documents that the department produces. What I am asking is that the department potentially would also have a Teach Grant website that would operate on the FSA website, so the Federal Student Aid website, and would engage in consumer testing to make sure that the Teach recipients have a full understanding of everything that they're required to do, and to make sure that the website stays up to date with what teachers are being asked to do every year.
So you would be asking for an additional website, is that what we're saying?
An additional website and consumer testing.
So that's something we'll have to take back and talk about.
If I can add, I mean, I agree with what's being said about consumer protections and being clear and accurate and such, and consumer usable. But there's also consumer responsibility. These are students in programs preparing to become a professional and then active professionals. And so there is responsibility, I think, to read the information. And as long as the information is clear and accessible, then I think that's okay. So I don't want to lose that piece of consumer responsibility as well.
And I definitely agree. However, as was reflected in part in the Public Citizen report, some of the information that has been distributed by the department has been inaccurate. And then teachers have been penalized, or there's a difference between the information that they're receiving from FedLoan and the information that they're receiving from the department. And so I would just hope that there would be an annual review, because there's so many different parties that are participating in making sure that teachers can fulfill their obligation, to make sure that it is intuitive to consumers.
I have a question for you in that the Teach Grant pops up on FSA. So are you looking for FSA to produce a different web page or a totally different website, or what are you looking for?
I'm just looking for FSA to conduct an annual review and consumer test it to make sure that it is completely accurate.
So it would be not an additional website to the already existing Teach website?
No.
Okay. So we'll take that back and come back with that. Other comments? So the FAFSA then replaces a lot of the language that you see struck out. And then you can see, for instance, in 86.11, we've replaced the word application with FAFSA. So that's going to be consistent throughout the document. let us know if we've missed any. Please.
Can I just ask a question? I did hear from a Teach Grant recipient who said that their grant was converted after they had a dispute with their school. Their GPA dropped. They were in a master's program. Their GPA dropped pending their dispute resolution process with their university, and they had their Teach Grant convert. My reading of the regulations is that that isn't supposed to happen. It's a question of eligibility. Whether or not your GPA drops below the allowable rate would not convert your grant. Is that correct?
I would say that the school can't do that conversion. Maybe what has happened to that student is the funds were replaced with the loan if they didn't qualify in a subsequent payment period. And you're not even supposed to recheck the GPA until the whole end of the academic year anyway, so maybe it was a different academic year. Or if they had a grade change to the beginning of a term that then made them ineligible, the school would have to, they're technically not eligible. Does that make sense? And I can see where it would be very confusing for the student, but the school wouldn't have the power to convert the grant into a loan itself. Does that make sense?
Yes, that does make sense. I do think that is one situation, because the issue was remedied with the school, where a clear dispute resolution process for the student is really useful, because again, you have a third party that's involved in the process. And eventually it was rectified, and the student's GPA did come back up, and they would have remained eligible, but at that point their grant had already converted, because either the institution went through the process with the department that then reported it to the servicer.
And others. Sorry.
I do have something to add here under I here. If we're going to say has submitted a completed FAFSA, and then other required additional information as noted in C, and that's the additional information requested by the secretary or the institution. Can we just add that to the...
Or maybe even just the word eligible FAFSA. Would that alleviate your concerns?
Well, if you want the additional application.
Right, but that's
'cause
already
eligibility-
delineated to be allowable in the previous section. But I think what you're saying is you don't want a student saying, I submitted a FAFSA, who cares if I didn't sign it or verify it or anything?
No, I was just saying down, no. Under I, under 68611, AI.
It's looking for your application.
We just have just the FAFSA. See right there, has completed a FAFSA.
Oh, okay, to repeat that.
And have, yeah.
Just to kind of make
If we
that
can
part
maybe
of
just
the-
repeat the same language, I think that would be
Yeah.
sufficient.
In 686-111, instead of 1 and 2, can it just say has met the application requirements and then go to number 3?
Oh, that would be good.
So just as a cross-reference.
Right.
Yeah.
And what that helps with... No, I'm suggesting, that was what my suggestion was, because those are the application requirements. It also helps with, when you do changes like this, for example, you don't carry over, serve, or repay. And so it helps with editing in the future.
So you don't have to have both spots.
Yeah.
Just two.
Has met the application requirements as stated in 686.10.
Thank you. Other suggestions, recommendations?
I actually have a question about the previous number 4, about completing requirements prior to graduating. So I know that's current language and there's no proposal to change that. But, sorry, it's so 686.11 A4, page 9. So page 9, 68611A4. Yep. So yeah, there's completing coursework, other requirements, blah, blah, blah. At the end it says, and intends to complete such coursework and requirements prior to graduating. So, for example, in New York State, the state exams are not required prior to the graduation. In fact, institutions cannot require the exams prior to graduation because then they'd have an artificial 100% pass rate for their students. So in that instance, they're actually not completing those requirements. They're not required to complete those. So they're certification requirements, they're not graduation requirements. And maybe this is unimportant because obviously the things have been operating for 11 years as is, but I just noticed that that's actually not meeting the way things operate.
Is it okay because this is talking about coursework only and potentially not certification?
Yeah, I think the coursework is what is the clarifying language that this is completed through the program itself, because it doesn't say licensure or certification. It says plans to complete such coursework and requirements. So,
well, the first part that says is completing coursework and other requirements necessary to begin a career in teaching. And so in New York, that would include the state exams. And fingerprinting is another piece too.
So I'm not sure that all institutions tie graduation or requirements in such a way that licensure and certification is connected to that for departure. And this is revolving around, there is an expectation, there's language in other places in the regs and the definitions that speak to full certification and throughout here. So I think that if we get too nitty-gritty on this, then coursework allows for preparation for licensure and certification exams as needed, or if they're required to complete it. But not everybody requires licensure or certification as part of the graduation process. Maybe I'm not understanding.
So what does other requirements mean then in this context?
It could be other things. To my interpretation, other things that are required
by the program.
By the program itself. You know,
it doesn't say that though.
No, but I mean, I don't think we want to specify, because then you're diving into looking at every single. There are 27,000 individual teacher prep programs in the United States. We're not going to be able to capture everything for those here, and so that leaves room for if there are other requirements outside of coursework, because again, some places might not consider clinical practice to be coursework per se, because they may interpret coursework to be working with a textbook or in a classroom, or different things like that.
So then instead of to begin a career in teaching, should it say as required by the teach eligible program in which they are enrolled? That's my question, because to begin a career in teaching would imply certification.
But this is already just focused on those teach eligible programs, so I don't think we need to add anything in there. I think it's how you're looking at the words to prepare career in teaching. This is much more broad, okay. I think, than I get you.
Yeah, and I don't want to create something that doesn't exist, but the way I read it, what's in operation now is not meeting this definition. But if it's okay, it's good.
Is that it's statutory.
Okay.
Yeah. Other concerns here? Or should we move
on? The information in my review prior to coming seemed like a lot of focus on the 3.25 and 4.0 on a 4.0 scale for the GPA. And that wasn't really my concern, because I do believe that it should be a high expectation. However, it seemed like a lot of additional language separating the difference between undergraduate and graduate, even though the requirement was really the same, which again can lead to confusion, because one is trying to understand why they are repeating that in so many different forms, saying the same thing.
The majority of this is based on the statutory language. In fact, did we give out the statute yet? No. Okay. So I just got to. Okay. Thank you.
Do you want me to hand it to you?
Oh no, you can. You can go through that.
So for reference, if you guys do want to know how to look this up online, so they break it down so that, yeah, in the law itself, and I can read it for you if you want
Yeah,
me to.
that's kind of what I was
Okay.
hoping to do. Yeah.
All
Go ahead.
right. So if the applicant is an enrolled student, if the student is an eligible student for the purposes of Section 484, which is a different part of HEA, which revolves around the FAFSA, I think, but I'm not sure. If the student has a grade point average that is determined under the standards prescribed by the Secretary to be comparable to a 3.25 average on a 0 to 4.0 scale, except that if the student is in the first year of a program of undergraduate education, such grade point average shall be determined on the basis of the student's cumulative secondary school grade point average or displayed high academic aptitude by receiving a score above the 75th percentile on or at least one of the batteries in an undergraduate, post-baccalaureate, or graduate school admissions test. And the student is completing coursework and other requirements necessary to begin a career in teaching or plans to complete such coursework and requirements prior to graduating. Or if the applicant is a current or prospective teacher applying for a grant to obtain a graduate degree, the applicant is a teacher or a retiree from another occupation with expertise in a field in which there is a shortage of teachers, such as mathematics, science, special education, English language acquisition, or another high-need subject, or the applicant is or was a teacher who is using high-quality alternative certification routes, such as Teach for America, to get certified. Page 258 of the comp.
Yes, but I guess let me be more specific. I'm concerned about the A, B, C, D, and E. I'm not for sure it's necessary when we've already done 1 and 2 on page 9.
Well, they're ors.
Is it?
They're not ands, it's an or for all of that. So if a student is in a first year, for instance, a final cumulative secondary school GPA of at least 3.25 on a 4.0 scale or the numeric equivalent, or, and then that lists option 2, a cumulative GPA of 3.25 on a 4.0 scale or the numeric equivalent based on courses taken at the institution through the most currently completed payment period. Then it lists out options depending on the student being beyond the first year of a program of undergraduate education. The student is a graduate student during the first payment period. The student is a graduate student beyond in other words, these are various cases that the student could find themselves in.
We need that as financial aid administrators in order to determine eligibility. So they try to keep it consistent.
That's the shorthand.
3.25, so the student knows 3.25, but we need this sort of breakdown so that we know how to measure the 3 and when to measure the 3.25.
Okay, thank you. That is helpful.
Great, thank you. Other concerns here. If not, we can move to B, current or former teachers or retirees. And here again, we've replaced application with FAFSA. And should we now include the additional language about the institutional requirements here as well?
I would like to see I'd like to see us do exactly the way we did before and just
Okay.
say met the application requirements.
Okay.
So the exact language that we put in number 5.
Yeah, but that way it won't require re-editing every time. No, I don't think we, yeah. Yes, right there. Right there.
Then in 1, we say, has signed an agreement to serve, and then we've struck, and we've added or repay. Now, this is a conforming change to 686.12, which is the agreement to serve, and now the agreement to serve and repay, which we are going to be getting to next, but it just happens to come up first, so we just caught it there and put it in there. So we'll be discussing this shortly. I just wanted to make that point. Other questions or comments on the current or former teachers? Okay. So let's then move to 686.12 agreement to serve. We have about a half an hour. I don't know that we'll get through this topic. This is a larger topic before we break for lunch. So we'll look for kind of maybe a natural break in this and then return to the rest of it after lunch, unless we get really lucky and everybody just loves everything. So you never know. The first thing we've done here, and I've mentioned this before, is that the agreement to serve is now the agreement to serve or repay. So what we've done here is we've changed the title to emphasize that the grant recipients must either perform the service obligation or repay the grant as a loan. We make this change, and everywhere that this agreement to serve appears, you'll see that conforming change everywhere. If we've missed one, like we just discovered we did miss one, we want to make sure to pick those up. So somebody said to me, actually, that had looked at this and said, well, so we had the really easy ATS, agreement to serve. Now we have ATSOR. So that's what it would be, ATSOR, the new way of talking about it. So to that end, we've added that language in general. Under A, we say a student who meets the eligibility requirements may receive a teach grant after he or she signs an agreement to serve or repay the grant as a loan, provide a secretary, that's, what am I even not seeing here? Provided by the secretary and receives counseling in accordance with 686.32. And we'll talk about the counseling requirements later. We have a lot of changes to that, but that essentially catches that. And then again, with the contents of the agreement or serve to repay, making that change there. Under 1, we are now conforming this language to the language way back in the purpose and scope, where we talked about completion in terms of completing, serving as a full-time teacher for a total of not less than 4 elementary or secondary academic years within 8 years after the date the recipient ceased to be enrolled in the program at the institution where the recipient received the teach grant.
We made a change earlier that also included if a teach recipient graduated from a transferring university as a start. Can we make a similar change here? Because right now it just looks like it only, the service clock starts when you cease enrollment at the institution where you receive the teach grant.
Yeah.
So this would be back at the scope. Yeah.
Yeah, I was also going to suggest that.
And before we get too far, I just want to say thank you. I think the name change is great and it adds quite a bit of clarity.
Great, thank you. Yes. The transfer institution were, yeah.
Just the transfer institution?
That piece, adding that piece, I think is what the request was. Correct?
Is this the appropriate place we talk about the differentiation between cease to be enrolled at the institution versus ceasing the program?
We could, I guess, because it's part of the agreement to serve.
because my concern was earlier when we were in the scope, and we were going to defer till later in the document, my concern is, well, much like we were talking with, I think it was Aaron, we have students who go into an eligible program, they receive the grant, good intentions, sign up for it, all this. They may get to their fourth year, second semester teaching, and say, no, can't do this. They re-enroll in something completely different and have no intention of teaching. They finish out another 3 years. Is it that point they cease enrollment that the repayment comes into play, or the conversion comes into play, or is it because they're not going to teach? They know this way back. And so I just want to make sure that we're at least addressing that, or giving the financial aid staff some parameters on how to advise those students, how it's going to work.
So I just wanted to check that I was correct about something. We don't have any way to track students that do that unless they tell us, please convert because I'm no longer going to. If they don't do that, then it would be when they would cease the program, because we would have no way to pick them up.
So are we
unless they tell
clear
us.
that striking the word program and program of study from these particular passages, that's not, I'm assuming y'all have already done this, you vetted this with the regulations. The regulations don't say program of study or eligible program.
Well, the statute initially said the program of study, but we've made it more operationalized by providing that it would be the date that the recipient ceased to be enrolled, so that it was more actionable, I guess is maybe the word I want.
And that's actually fine because it benefits my student. I just want to make sure. I just want to make sure that we're clear on that, because if we're advising the students, we need to know exactly what's going to happen at the department level.
And I think it's important too, some students even get counseled out. They just don't quite, they get advised that this is perhaps not the career for them, and knowing how to handle it, they get directed into another program, and unfortunately have this then debt that's added on, so.
I would propose adding an addition to the ATS that would be voluntary conversion, potentially in bold, so that the student, when they sign the ATS, when they review the document, hopefully when they're thinking about transferring programs and realizing that they're not going to teach, would then see that they should voluntarily convert to prevent the unintended accrual of additional interest. So that would probably be at the bottom. I have it, potential language, subsection F, voluntary conversion in italics. So I would add a whole nother subsection at the end, and that way it's not
So you would add a whole another F.
yes. And then it would be voluntary conversion in italics, copying the formatting above. Emphasize to the grant recipient. No. That, comma, if they decide not to fulfill their service obligation by teaching in a high-need position in a low-income school, comma, they should ask their servicer to convert the grant into a loan so that they do not accrue additional retroactive interest. And then thank you.
Actually, I was going to suggest taking out the verbiage right after the word obligation and just leaving the comma because it's sort of repetitive. The obligation is that. Right. And it also only has school in there.
No,
so-
just to the comma.
No, right, just between obligation and the comma.
How does everybody feel about
And
this
then-
addition? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, one more little change. Instead of emphasized, past tense, emphasize. There we go.
So I'm just a little confused with regard to this. So if they're already asking for the conversion, why would we emphasize for them to ask for the conversion?
So there are students who don't know that they could voluntarily convert when they sign up for the program. So, because for them, you know, they're thinking, well, I have every intention to teach when they opt in, hopefully, and teach in these specified positions. And so this is just creating another flag for the borrower/grant recipient to be aware that at the point they know that they cannot fulfill the service obligation, they themselves should voluntarily opt in.
So it's almost like an added component to the exit counseling then, maybe.
Yeah, so it's making sure that in the same way that we would inform them of their service obligations, we also inform them of the option to voluntarily convert.
I would think both, but it becomes probably a little more important at exit.
Out of curiosity, is that exit interview when they exit, for example, if they were counseled out of the program or when they leave the institution itself?
Probably depend on the institution. I know that any chance I have to counsel, I would counsel. But regulatorily, it would be when they left the institution.
So that would almost miss this point. So it would also be something to just continue.
Yeah, so I'm trying to
just-
figure out how it fits into the whole stream of requirements.
I think our, great idea, but I do think our language may need to be a little bit more in line with how the rest of these are written. So I'm not the person to wordsmith that, but, because I see what she's saying and I completely agree with that. But it doesn't read smoothly from one to the next.
If you give me time tonight, I will come back in tomorrow. I am flagging it, highlighting it.
And I would just like to ensure that this wouldn't become a regulatory burden on behalf of the schools that would have to monitor program fluctuations, SIP code changes, whatever that may be. It could become extremely difficult to administer depending on how it's going to be interpreted.
And I think that's going to be in the wording. I think it's going to, if I look at it here, E says if a grant recipient fails or refuses to carry out the service obligation, if we start something off much like that, if the grant recipient decides not to fulfill their thing, it's like the burden will be put back on them, but it's all in the wording. It's all in the wording.
My understanding was also, because it's the agreement to serve, that this is governing what actually gets put in the form. And so that was the reason for it to be framed that way. But I will absolutely switch it so that it conforms with the rest.
I was going to say, I think the location doesn't necessarily ensure. I know that's what your intention is, to have it in the agreement, but the contents of the agreement is under B, and you're suggesting an F. So I would recommend that we take this and maybe consider putting it under B, which is the contents of agreement to serve, so that it doesn't become that extra requirement you're talking about, I think, but still meets what you're targeting for. I would make it Roman numeral 4, maybe, B1-4.
I think we also need to make sure back in 1 that we clarify unless there is an exemption granted or approved exemption granted somewhere in there, whereas where we indicate under the agreement to serve that there is an allowable exemption, and then refer them to the appropriate area in the document, because here we've heavily talked about repay and talked about their agreement to serve, but we've not indicated anywhere up to this point that there are exemptions that stop the clock. So where we have under full-time teachers and talk about the calendar survey, we should draw their attention to the appropriate section that clarifies the exemptions, the opportunities for the candidate.
So like making it a Roman numeral or a little v and adding it in as their, because part of 4 would be to say, hey, if you depart, you should do this quick, convert quick, but also understand there are very prescribed conditions under which you can request a suspension or other things. Is that what you're sort of targeting?
Correct. I think where we've been very clear with the terms of service and been very clear with the repayment, we've not been clear that there can be a window in which you continue to serve with an approved exemption. And so
We do discuss these later on, but I think your point, and correct me if I'm wrong, is to sort of centralize everything here so that all these things would be easily triggerable in the agreement to serve to anybody that's reading it. Does that sound about?
We're going to need to do some relocating of some of this. If you look under 1, they're describing the conditions for. Yeah, sorry, under B1, where we placed the Romanet 4, that may not be the right place for that. It may be better as a, we can work all of this out. These are small things, but I don't think it fits
Right.
where we have
You're
it.
saying like its own numbers.
Because what we're talking about in,
The number 4 as opposed to Romanet 4, I think is what you're.
right.
But I thought we were trying to put that into the agreement to serve.
Right, so
and
then-
the contents of agreement to serve is B.
Right, so then
Right.
we have
B4
B1, 2,
is what
3
he's saying.
under,
Right, and that would be little Roman numeral 4, and then I believe we wanted to add Roman numeral 5. I thought that's what we were just trying to do.
Oh, okay, because they went up as Romanettes, not.
Yeah. I think not Roman numeral 4, but Arabic 4.
Yeah, right, Romanet, those are the Romanettes.
Just to clarify, so everything that follows B, so C and the subsequent subsections would not go in the agreement to serve? They're in there now. These definitional terms?
Is it all laid out? It is, actually.
Yes.
Structurally, I'm just thinking of legislation, sorry.
No, totally. But
I think all
in
these
terms
pieces
of-
are there,
We made it.
but
sort
you're
of-
saying you wanted laid out here, I think is what because of it being the contents.
Well, what I'm saying is this whole subsection, so 686.12 could govern what is included in the written agreement to serve. I wasn't thinking about it in terms of you have to counsel that this is what the agreement to serve means. To me, an agreement to serve is a written document, and so anything that's included in the entirety of this regulation would then be included within the written document.
Yes. The agreement to serve is an approved document. So yes, everything that would be in the agreement to serve is laid out here in different pieces.
Okay.
So the things listed in subsection B are not an exhaustive list of everything that would be included within the agreement? Okay.
Okay. I have one if anybody wants to look at it. Yeah, the agreement to serve is 21 pages, so.
And I've been reminded that, as you know, when we do our NPRM, because the agreement to serve is essentially an information collection, there'll be a separate opportunity to comment on that in addition to the NPRM. Does that make sense?
And let me try to go back to my original comment regarding where we talk about the years of service. It was mentioned earlier that if someone were to either be counseled in taking part in this grant, or during the grant opportunity, they are take some kind of maternity leave or are expecting to take some kind of leave somewhere in the process, that as well as any other thing, that any other exemption that might stop them from serving the entire length of time consecutively, that they don't fear that that will in essence trigger the subsidized loan situation that we are right now experiencing with so many. And so I was just saying, under where we talk about the 8 calendar years, that we would make sure that we indicate that there are some opportunities for exemption, which aren't mentioned until much later. And so just indicating that and drawing attention to that is also in the document, because most of our candidates aren't reading the entire policy. They are only reading that which they think they need to in order to, and as soon as they see the 8 years, for many candidates it is either immediately triggering, I don't know if I'm going to be able to fulfill this obligation, or if they are already in receipt of the grant, they are worried about where they are going to be employed and if that employment will last the entire 8 years. And so I'm a little worried that we have not indicated anywhere on here regarding either the scope or here where we talk about eligibility or under agreement to serve, that there is an opportunity for exemption or a time out, if you will, for those candidates to continue their process.
So would you cross-reference to those sections then? Is that what you were thinking?
That is what I was thinking, but I think we need to put it up further in the document so that it does not end up giving false information to the candidate, whereas they think that there is no other option but to serve or repay.
Could we say at each place that we reference within 8 calendar years, we could add something like within 8 calendar years, comma, with allowable exceptions as pursuant to section so-and-so. Everywhere that's listed, it would be referenced.
My preference would be in parentheses, whereas it would draw their attention to another place in the document as opposed to a laundry list. But yes, that is my thought, that if we give that information up front, we might have less students that are defaulting later on.
And just as a point of reference, it's number 3 in the agreement to serve. So discussing those things. And the first part is really about just the basics, and then the service obligation and how to find the schools. If you want to see the agreement.
So just to clarify, Are you talking about including this additional cross-reference in part of this section 12 for agreement to serve, in addition to including it in the actual agreement to serve? You follow what I'm saying? Or are you being specific to the actual agreement to serve as opposed to the regulatory part relating to the agreement to serve?
I'm saying in the actual agreement to serve that we should indicate that there are allowable exemptions.
In other words, different than what
But I'll
we
defer
have.
to my
Yeah.
financial aid consultants here, if that is appropriate or if that would be enough for counseling as well. But I think we've heard a lot of conversation about the counseling and not necessarily the procedural for the candidates understanding their both eligibility as well as their service. And I think we need something like that that would make sure that the candidates fully understood that there are opportunities in which they can continue their service even without necessarily having continuous employment.
And what I would say to that is I think it would become repetitive by putting it in the regulatory language that most students probably, some will, but most probably won't reference the regulatory language. More important should be placed in the actual agreement to serve. And so because of that, I think that it is covered because it is in the regulatory, although it's not repeated, if that makes sense.
Well, to speak to the difference between institutions, as Alyssa's already mentioned, I would like to have it in the regulatory language as well, because I know financial aid staffers will jump to a section in a regulation, and if it's right there real quick, then it's a lot easier to communicate as the student sitting in front of you rather than reading the whole thing. So if it's not an issue, I would like to have it in there.
Can you provide us with like the language and where?
My friend Willis can.
Well, we can come back to that. But I think
actually, we
that,
have 4 minutes to lunch, so yes,
well,
maybe a noon
but
conversation.
I think it, with what Deborah shared with me, I think we could find some language in here under the deferment and or other language from the actual agreement to serve to come up with something.
I think, just as a word of caution, as soon as we start putting verbiage from a document into regulation, then we constrain the way in which we can further tweak the document moving forward, just as a word of caution.
Well, my point is just to be consistent. And for, I mean, if we want to work on the language, I'm all for that. I just think that we should, where we do talk about continuous service, that we just say something as it relates to the exemptions and or deferment that can also occur without someone losing their loan or converting to a loan.
So we have basically 2 proposals on the table. One is to make some changes to the actual information collection agreement to serve the document that the student signs. And we also have a proposal to add something to the actual regulations to reflect what will then be reflected in the agreement to serve, correct? And we're going to get some language back this afternoon from one or both of you with recommendations for that. And with it being 11:58, almost 11, I'm hoping that's correct. I should check my own. Yeah, it's correct. I think this is a great place to stop our conversation and then resume again at 1 o'clock after lunch. So I'll just wish everybody bon appetit and thank you for this morning.